G'day, Kate from Narrate Church here. This week, Adam concludes our marriage and relationship series, Want It, Have It, Wish I Didn't, by unpacking what at first glance appears to be a narrow topic, that of empty nesting. As you will hear, Jesus teaches us to invest in our lives in such a way that it positively impacts relationships, far more than just the empty nester.
This morning we're going to wrap up this series, Want It, Have It, Wish I Didn't, which has been a relationship series, which has really been an attempt to, in hopefully somewhat sarcastic narrate fashion, to go, hey, listen, these relationship things, those are hard. And if we're not careful, we define success by getting that relationship and then ever so quickly wish we didn't get that relationship. And so we get rid of it, drop kick back into the pond. And so what we've been trying to do here is not shame so much as just have a candid conversation about, hey, what are some best practices as it relates to relationships? And listen, I don't for a second think that we've been exhaustive or that we have a corner on the market there. I think part of our responsibility as a community together is to revisit these issues, if not annually, real close, and just pay really close attention to just some new little things that we can put in our tool belt to think about relationships and hopefully have better relationships. And this morning, if you've been trafficking with us in this series, then you're already aware of the fact that what we're going to talk about this morning is preparing for the empty nest, which feels really myopic in its scope, right? And to be honest with you, when we first committed to doing a series, or ending the series by talking about preparing for the empty nest, I anticipated it to be a weekend that was mostly boring for most of you. And yet, for reasons I'll talk about in a second, we were still committed to doing that. But before you check out because you're 13, or before you check out because your nest is already empty, or before you check out because you don't want to have kids, and that's okay too. Let me just kind of, if I could just say this, it's going to take me a while to get to it, but what happened to me in preparing for this message and happened to me as I was researching this message and having conversation and certainly looking at the text and going, okay, Lord, like, how does your word then apply to our world today? Like, what would this look like? I was pretty shocked at actually what came to the surface as it relates to the tools that we can use. And what was shocking to me was I think you'll leave understanding this isn't a myopic topic at all. That, yeah, we're going to talk about marriage and how do we prepare to have an empty nest when our kids are gone. But really, we're talking about way more than marriage. Really, we're talking about goals, we're talking about ambitions, we're talking about focus, we're talking about excellence. So whatever your goal, whatever your desire, however it is you're defining the win right now, I'm really convinced that this morning you can take stuff from this, even if you're going like, my friends have kids. I'm never doing that to myself. That's okay. I still think there's stuff that you can use from all of this. But first, let me address so why are we doing it? Because again, it's very specific, and you can't open to the text in the Bible that says, and when the last kid leaves the home, here's what you should do. It's not there. That's part of what we have to do as people 2,000 years later is interpret the text. Here's what I watched, is this last fall, it began to occur to me that I have a lot of meetings with a lot of very well-intentioned, godly, even Jesus-following people who want to meet with me because their last kid has left the house and suddenly they don't like their spouse, and the decisions they're contemplating are things that they know don't necessarily honor God. The things they're contemplating are things that they're not even necessarily proud of, and yet they feel kind of trapped. In fact, what I began to realize this last fall, and there were several relationships, and the more that I've thought about this, the more that I can identify these tendencies, was that in some cases, the trouble didn't begin when the last kid left the house. In some cases, the trouble begins months or even years before the last child leaves the house. And yet, here's where it gets weird. You'll have to follow me here. I think oftentimes we make decisions that are totally in light of the fact that we're about to have an empty nest, but we don't know that's why we're doing what we're doing. And we have lots of kind of colloquial terms. The midlife crisis is probably the most common. But what I began to see is that it's not even necessarily the last kid has finally went off to Bozeman or to Missoula or to wherever, and suddenly there's problems. It's like, no, he's an 8th grader, and he's the youngest, and suddenly someone in the marriage is freaking out because they don't want to be stuck with her or they don't want to be stuck with him in 4 years. I've likened it in my own mind. When I was in high school, so in 8th grade, and I've talked a little bit about this, but I think it's a helpful parallel. When I was in 8th grade, I made an all-star team, which had, I think there were 14 of us on the team. There was one other kid my age. Everybody else had just finished their freshman year of high school. And I think all of us that have been through high school can appreciate the different stage of life that is. A bunch of kids who are still in middle school and a bunch of kids who just finished their first year of high school. And we spent a great deal of time together that summer as we prepared for tournaments and things like that. The result was some of my best friends going into high school were these guys who had just finished their freshman year. And because of several different circumstances in my life, I got into things way quicker my freshman year than I otherwise would have. I got caught up in the fact that I was cool because my friends were a year older than me and kind of ditched the students that were my own age. Those friends, we all kind of lacked proper coaching. And so and again, I'm not trying to glorify this or be even redundant, but by about, I don't know, maybe October of my freshman year, getting stoned became our hobby. And I literally could count on a couple hands at most the number of times from that point until almost the end of my junior year that wasn't what lunch involved for us. And it's like 7 days a week. That was kind of our thing. We didn't deal. We didn't steal. We didn't even party. None of us were. That's part of what happened to us is the whole temperament thing kind of fit real nicely. We just were a bunch of dudes with baggy corduroy pants who drove around in a 65 Impala and smoked weed. And I'm not trying to say that was in any way innocent, but that was our identity. But here's what started happening my junior year. My junior year, I started to connect the dots, and I didn't even know that at the time. It stood out to me this week as I was thinking about this message. My junior year, I started to recognize, wait a minute, my friends are all graduating this year. And I think we're all a little bit selfish, and we're all good at self-preservation. And again, it took till I was 35 to fully understand this. I started to panic a little bit because I'd alienated all my friends. My senior year was going to be miserable. And then that was all kind of capped off by the fact that my mentor and one of the guys that I really looked up to, he battled cancer and ultimately committed suicide. And so that really caused me to go like, okay, I need some change. And so the change that I sought came in the form of a girlfriend because I didn't want to be alone, right? And so I redirected my whole life toward her to the extent that I don't even remember those friends' graduation parties. I just completely ditched them. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is I saw this change coming, and I was terrified by it. And so I did some really aggressive planning. I know that would be shocking to you that I thought and planned in advance and all those different things so that I didn't have to deal with the tension of that. Listen, this is actually the more common scenario I see in my interactions with couples. It's typically not couples panicking because the last kid left. It's typically couples panicking because their kids are sophomores or their youngest is a sophomore, and they're not sure whether or not they want to be here when they're gone because they're not sure how much they still like him. And so I began to ask this question, Lord, what are the best practices? How do my friends, how do we actually think about this and prepare for it in such a way that we actually thrive through it? Because think of this, like if you're married, and sorry if you're not, and realize that this is why I said what I did at the front end. Like, do you know anybody who married somebody because they thought, wow, man, she'd make a good mother to my kids, or he'd make a good father, and so I think I'll marry her, or I'll marry him, and we'll raise a family together, and then about the time the last kid's gone, we're done. No use for her after that. Like that, nobody stands on the altar as that being their motivation. In most cases, what happens is we fall in love with somebody, we become enamored with somebody, we become psychotic about somebody, we commit our lives to them, and then this thing called kids happens, and we decide that we'll cope with that. But in the span of 10, 20, 30 years, depending on how it all transcribes for you, or how it all transpires for you, that suddenly what started as you and her or you and him lacks any identity without 2 kids in the mix, without 3 kids in the mix, without a kid in the mix. Andy Stanley points out that there are 4 seasons to family. There's pre-kids, there's little kids, there's teenage kids, and there's empty nest. The question we're asking here is, how do we move from pre-kids to empty nest and still actually want to be with that person? Lord, what do we do here? Because we end up at this destination that none of us sought, none of us set out for, so how do we avoid that? And again, this is where I was just blown away at the results, because let me just kind of tip my hand. Here's the bottom line of all the research that I did, that guys like Cloud and Townsend and others who I researched. Here's the bottom line. When the last kid leaves, that doesn't represent a unique challenge to your marriage. There's nothing in the research that says that an empty nest is disproportionately hard on a couple. What the research says is when the last kid leaves the nest, when the last kid moves out, what happens is the marriage is exposed. That if the marriage in the course of the last 20 plus years has become about the kids, that'll become known. It's what Cloud and Townsend call avoiding invaders or intruders. And when you begin to think in terms of how do we avoid intruders, you begin to recognize we're not just talking about marriage anymore. If you've ever sought out to get a degree, if you've ever desired to, as your freshman year, to play on the varsity team when you were a senior, if you've ever run a business, if you've ever built a house, if you've ever done anything that had a start point and an end point and more than 10 seconds in between, you understand that there's always a tension between like the actual desire and the fulfillment of the desire. And you know something? Jesus goes right after this in what I think is one of the most important passages in all of his teaching. We talked about it last spring, and I just think that like if you buy that God made us, that he hardwired you from the DNA outward, then it seems to me that part of what Jesus is telling us in this passage is, listen, I know the way you're made, I know your capacity, and this capacity will either take you out or you'll leverage it for my glory and for your fulfillment. Listen to this. This would be the most anticlimactic verse I've ever read to you for those of you that are familiar with it. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal. Now, oftentimes we picture a guy with a megaphone shouting at us angrily saying, like, don't do this. And we have the sense that if we're not giving every extra cent to a church or we're not somehow like doing something that somehow translates to heaven, that somehow God is angry at us. I would like to suggest to you that Jesus is not condemning the fact that you treasure. That you will treasure is a foregone conclusion that he's already come to. But listen to what he says. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. See, the issue for Jesus is not whether you will treasure. That you will treasure is a fact in Jesus' mind. It's how. It's what. You have a treasuring capacity. Jesus concerns himself with how do you leverage that? How do you use that? How do you spend that resource? And do you see here how very quickly we're talking about marriage and we're talking about everything else in life? Here's one way to say it, that the propensity for our affections to wander never goes away. And that's true if you're in med school, that's true if you've got your first job, that's true if you've set out to have some kind of a degree. Go ahead, Matthew, put that next one up there, will you? The propensity for our affections to wander never goes away. It just never goes away. You know this. And what applies to your ability, your desire to lose weight or to complete a certain race or to save to a certain amount or to go on a certain trip or to get a certain job applies to your marriage. That distractions are everywhere, that intruders ruin dreams. I was recalling this week that there was this moment when I was 21 years old and very new in the faith and very naive where a couple that I looked up to mightily, Teresa and I looked up to, they were in their late 20s, they had young kids. He was very successful. They were both former collegiate athletes. They were very involved in the church that we had recently planted. He had become a Big Sky conference basketball official, like kind of moved up the ranks very, very rapidly. And I was just completely caught off guard. It was the first time I watched this where this supposed dream marriage just came to a crashing end. I was new to the faith. I'd never seen this happen before. I couldn't even reconcile it in my head. And I remember processing that with my friend Fred, who many of you know now from a couple weeks ago. And Fred, in a very non-shaming, very matter-of-fact way, said, Adam, marriage only really works if it's the dream. Marriage only really works if both the husband and the wife decide that the dream that they carry with them in life is the marriage. And he would reinforce this to me time and time and time again as I was processing life and ministry opportunity and career opportunity and hobbies and all those things. He always drew me back to the point of, Adam, you can have all those things. None of those things are bad. But to love your wife as Christ loves the church means that when she walked down that aisle to be your wife, you made a conscious decision to make your marriage your number one dream. See, you quickly see how hard and yet how simple this is, right? Jesus is going, hey. Your dream was to marry her. Your dream was to marry him. be careful, because all the energy you have for that can so easily be shifted to any number of other good or not so good things. I actually got the opportunity to watch this principle play itself out in our own midst and in this last month, and I just repeatedly am reminded of I'm just humbled by what God is doing and the quality of people that you all are, and this interaction just further reinforced all that. There's this couple, and they, just to give you a little bit of context here, they moved here a year ago for him to pursue his dream job. So he got offered a promotion here. She already had a career there. They had a daughter who was in elementary school. But he got this offer, and she sacrificed her career. Hers wasn't the type of career. It was a tenured thing, so it wasn't like you just kind of transfer your job here, like I can cut hair there, I can cut here. It wasn't one of those things. For her, it was giving up all this past that she had, all this former issue, all these former opportunities that she had, but they did it. Daughter struggled socially, but she did it. And they got here, and then the last year has been a struggle in some regards, as you might expect when you move away from your family and your hometown and all these different things. And I became aware of their situation because she was actually one of the applicants for the leadership role that we had open. And then part of the way through that process, actually, she emailed me and withdrew her interest, her application. And I was like, well, why? And she said, well, for reasons that'll become clear when you talk to my husband. And that never sounds good, right? So kind of did a little work quickly there and quickly found out, okay, it's not a bad thing necessarily. And finally, we had the chance to have a conversation, and it was real simple, though extraordinarily difficult. He had been offered the same dream position, but only this time it was back in the hometown, which was a much bigger market than this one. And literally in his head, he's thought about ever since he started his career, if I could ever have that job in that town, I'd never move again. There's bigger markets, there's higher paying roles that have that job. I wouldn't want any of them. If I could be there and live close to my family and close to our friends, that would be perfect. And so they were deciding, do I take this job? And the tone of the meeting was real obvious. She was emotional, but not in this like, he's a jerk, I'm afraid he's gonna hurt me kind of way. He was stressed, but not in a like, my wife's not supportive kind of way. They just had this incredibly weighty decision on the table. Their daughter had finally started to make some connections, and they're like, can we really do this again? We finally made strides financially. She's finally made strides socially. What do we do? And they were looking at me going, so what do we do? What does God say to do? And I was like, why are you asking me? Like, I don't know. The only thing I did, the only advice I gave him was I said, I think you need to go out to dinner and you need to buy an expensive glass of wine, and I think you need to celebrate the fact that you were offered the job. Because what I see from where I sit also often is we often feel like we can't celebrate the opportunity unless we say yes to the opportunity, but that if we'll separate those two things, like the opportunity from taking the opportunity, we'll actually think through it more clearly. And so I said, go celebrate that you got the offer, because that's rare to get the offer. You know what's more rare than that? To get the offer and not take it. So just separate those two things. Now, I didn't hear from him. And then it was a couple weeks later, I shot him an email, hey, how's that going? And the next day I bumped into him before he could answer me back in the coffee shop. And I said, how's it going? And he said, I told him no. I was shocked, honestly. Like, I was like, there's no way. I'd already kind of counted them gone in my head. There's no way. I was like, you're kidding me. I said, yeah, they're saying the same thing. And I couldn't believe I said no. I said, what? Why? And he said, and I don't remember exactly what words he used, but he said, my wife just couldn't get comfortable with it. And it wasn't in this like passing the buck kind of way, and it wasn't in this and she wears the pants and I'll be miserable for the rest of my life kind of way. It was none of that. It was in this God-honoring, mutually submitted kind of, it didn't ever really sit well with her, and because it didn't ever really sit well with her, it didn't ever really sit well with me, and so I just said no. And I literally got goosebumps, and if I wasn't German, I would have jumped up and hugged him or something, but I just went like, good job. I think I might have given him a high five, but that might be giving myself too much credit. And I retold that story that I just told you of Fred, and I said, dude, you just kept the marriage the dream. You just kept the marriage the number one goal. And in one sense, that's so simple. But in another, it's extraordinarily complicated, isn't it? That there's these intruders. And what happens to a business venture? Do you ever go to a business and you look around and go, man, at some point, somebody had a vision for this thing. And then you go, but that was 10 years ago. That was 20 years ago. See, we're not just talking about marriage. We're talking about all of it. You see, at that point, what we understand is that what stands between where we are and where we're trying to get is the monotonous, the mundane, the boring, the unexciting, the lack of emotion. That's the real hard work of life, right? One of my favorite quotes of all times is Jim Collins, who says, the signature of mediocrity is chronic inconsistency. I know you hate sports analogies because I use them too often, but you know what amazes me about, I don't know, a guy like Peyton Manning if you're a football fan, or Tom Brady, or a guy like Tim Duncan if you're a basketball fan? You know what amazes me about athletes who are at the top of their sport 10, 15 years into it? It's that they're not coasting. Like, to find the motivation to get to the top, to find the motivation to get her ring on your finger, easy. But to think that Peyton Manning at 37, 38 years old, or Tim Duncan at 110 years old, I don't know, that guy's been around forever. to think that those guys, they have to work as hard in the off season and spend as much time in the weight room as they did when they were 17. Can you imagine? See, that's the issue. I remember when I was doing my premarital work, we got married at a church in Billings, and there was a guy named Ron Todd that did our premarital, kind of those official meetings. And I still remember this time. It obviously was somewhat, well, it was emblazoned into my head because I still remember it. But I remember him creating this picture of Teresa and I pulling into the back of the county market parking lot. Do you remember County Market? Remember those places? Am I dating myself? I don't know what happened to County Market. Maybe it must have been Walmart, but in Billings, there was a giant county market on the corner of 24th and Grand, and he said, Adam, someday, Adam, you're going to pull into the back of the parking lot at County Market, and you and your wife, or you and Teresa, she's not your wife now, but you're going to get out of the car, and you're going to start walking into County Market, and she's going to grab your hand to hold your hand, and at some point, you're going to be walking into County Market holding one another's hands, and you're not going to feel anything. And I remember thinking, man, it sucks to be his wife. And now I get it, don't you? And I remember him, again, I don't remember what words he used, but he made this very loud statement, Adam, those are the moments that determine the quality of a marriage. Those are the moments that determine how long this thing goes. It's your ability to guard your treasuring capacity. Imagine this gal named Katie who, she grew up in a house where there's dogs, and she loves dogs, and she goes off to college, and she can't have a dog in the dorm room, and then she's in a college town, and so no one's dumb enough to let a college kid have a dog, and so she grieves the fact that she goes through college without, sorry if you own a house in a college town where they can have dogs, I didn't mean to call you dumb. But she goes through her whole college career kind of angry that she doesn't have a dog, sad that she doesn't have a dog, kind of missing out on life in her mind because she doesn't have a dog. And so she ultimately determines that when she graduates, wherever she goes, she's going to find an apartment where she can have a dog. And so she does graduate, and she gets a job in her hometown, and she gets a dog. She spends way too much money on a dog. She already has college debt. She buys a Labradoodle, which are great because they don't shed, but they still do all kinds of other repulsive things. And so she gets this Labradoodle, and she just loves Puppy. I mean, they go to obedience classes together, and they like have their pictures taken together, and it's their Christmas card, and on Facebook, it's their profile picture, and like he goes to work with her, and this is one of those situations, he wears those silly little sweaters, like dogs, like they couldn't have evolved without them. I'm not sure we need them now, but whatever, sorry, there's a tangent, but like she does all these kind of things that people do with dogs. Sorry if you're a dog person, I know you love your dogs, but she's just caught up in her dog. And then about a year and a half later, her boss calls her into the office, and he says to her, hey, there's this promotion, there's this position opening up, I want you to apply for it. And she'd never even thought about this position before, but she's competitive and she's a winner, so she wants the job. Like, she hasn't really thought about whether or not she wants the job, she just knows she likes to win, and so she's got to get the job now because there's this newest objective that she can conquer. And so she applies, and she goes through a lot of work, and she gets the job, she lands the job, and it's not until she's actually landed the job that she stops to think about the fact that her life just changed dramatically because now she travels 5 days a week. And so she's sitting at home thinking, oh yeah, well, I guess I'm going to have to figure out something to do with Puppy because Puppy can't go on the road with me. And so she calls up her mom, who lives in the same town and lives on the other side of town, and says, hey Mom, could I bring Puppy to you perhaps on Monday morning, and then I'll come pick him up when I get into town on Friday? Sure, she said, that'd be great. And so for several weeks, that's what happens. And she gets into town as soon as she can on Friday. She's crying when she drops the Puppy off on Monday. I mean, it's this dramatic thing. But eventually kind of time passes. And pretty soon it's not 4 o'clock on Friday, it's 6 o'clock on Friday. And then eventually she decides she wants to go hang out with some friends on Friday. And so she doesn't even pick Puppy up on Friday. She picks him up on Saturday morning. And then pretty soon she gets sick of having to drive across town on Sunday morning or Monday morning. So she takes him over to her mom's house on Sunday night. And then winter hits and she gets into town and she doesn't want to drive across town in the snowstorm. And so she calls mom and says, hey, can I just leave him there? And before long, like she's just skipping weekends because she goes on vacation with friends, and now she's used to her new job and she wants to have a life too. And so there's all these things happening. And eventually what happens is she goes over to her mom's house and she realizes that Puppy hasn't been over for a month. And when she calls him, he goes to her mom. And she realizes suddenly, well, that's not even my dog anymore. See, it's predictable, isn't it? Every parent who's got a dog that wasn't originally theirs can appreciate the story. It's predictable, though it probably doesn't have to be inevitable. Or imagine a guy named Adam who has this vision of being a certain kind of a church, and he talks to his wife and some friends, and they get excited about this way of being the church, and it's really centered around this idea that they don't even like church, but what they would love to do is like follow Jesus in the everyday context of their lives. And so they start dreaming about creating this context and this movement where they would actually not be a subculture within the community, but they'd actually be part of the community, like the city would partner with them on things. And so they work hard to create these Sunday morning experiences, but then they decide like, hey, we're not going to invite people to connect through small groups and prayer gatherings and all those things that are good things. What we're going to say is if you want to get involved, if you want to get connected relationally, like come serve with us. And everything is centered around like come serve, because if you start with community, you never get to mission, but if you start with mission, you'll get to community, and things begin to happen and things begin to grow and people are having fun and there's good response and there's energy coming out of it and there's people from other sides of the aisle like worshiping together. And then there's even people with these like storied pasts in the community, they're showing up and people are going like, wow, they go here now too, that's crazy. There's all these things happening. And then imagine it around year 20, Adam gets really, really excited about real estate. Nothing against real estate. And he starts spending all of his free time studying real estate, and he starts going to conferences whenever he can take a vacation, and he's talking to friends, and pretty soon he's buying real estate, and pretty soon he's even helping friends sell real estate, and there's all this passion in the direction of real estate going on and on and on, and eventually he's kind of stealing hours from the workday to work on real estate stuff. And there's this like reserve of energy that the place can continue to exist on and burn that reserve, but eventually the reserve runs out. And the staff is starting to get a little frustrated at Adam's absent leadership. And before long, like people are still coming, but it's been a long time since anybody who didn't really like church came. And they don't really scatter anymore. They just tell war stories about times they used to scatter. Remember that crazy thing we did called Ales for Trails? That was crazy. And before long, like the thing is just kind of pathetic. Like it exists, but it mostly just exists for them. See, it's predictable, isn't it? It's not inevitable, but it's predictable. See, what strikes me as I was wrestling through this, like, how do we prepare for an empty nest thing is, well, at the risk of objectifying your spouse, at the risk of objectifying people, the reason why we struggle is the same reason why we have dusty canoes and bass guitars under our bed and any number of other things that we haven't touched in years. Squirrel, right? Like, that's the answer. Because we're all so easily distracted. And Jesus, it just seems to me that he spends a lot of energy just addressing the fact that you have God's lifeblood in you. And what you invested in matters. Listen to this story he tells. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for fine pearls. But we understand just how committed to fine pearls he is when he found one of great value. He went away and sold everything he had and bought it. See, here's the simple, though extraordinarily difficult answer. The way you prepare for an empty nest is to keep your spouse your treasure. And that's not easy, but that's Jesus' direction. And the way you actually have a successful company 30 years from now is you make it your treasure. And the way you actually accomplish fill in the blank is you figure out how to push through the lack of passion. Could I share an opinion? I hate the word passion. Us Christians, we use it so much. And I would suggest to you it's empty, sentimental emotionalism. There's nothing in it. Now I'm kind of off track and ranting, but on fire, same empty thing. I don't care how on fire they are, do you? I want to know at 1 p.m. when their blood sugar's low and they want to take a nap, how committed are they? That's the issue, right? It's how hard are we willing to work? How consistent are we willing to be? So let me ask you, if you're married, is your spouse your treasure? Like, is that the dream? Above everything else, is the dream to leverage everything you can to serve her, to serve him. I think you could go before God in the end and have led 0 people to the Lord and lived a pretty average life when it comes to how many Bible verses you know, and be pretty unconnected with regards to the who's who in the Christian subculture of your town, and have honored God if what you've done is kept your marriage the win. Now let me kind of unpack a few of those kind of research-based things that I ran into before we swing back to Jesus and pray. I did bump into, because I promised to do some research, so I tried to summarize my research in 4 things. So the research takeaways from me, first of all, what was the simple thing of evenings after the kids are in bed. Emotionally, what we know is that kids benefit mightily from knowing that there's a relationship that they don't get to be a part of. Isn't that weird? Because we spend so much time as parents trying to include our kids. What clinical psychologists understand is that one of the best things you can accomplish for your kids emotionally is to model for them to have that they would see mom and dad have something that we don't get to be part of. So there's us, all of us, but then there's them. And that there's a very clear understanding that we don't always get to be a part of them. What many would say is one of the most effective ways to create that for yourself and your kids is that when they've gone off to bed and then they've got up for the 37th time to go to the bathroom, though they're not really going to the bathroom, they're just checking up on you, right? Because my kids are the only ones that do that, I'm sure. That they would see you and your spouse not having gone your own separate ways, not pursuing your hobbies, at least not all the time, but they would see you connecting together. That they would understand there's something there that we don't get to be a part of. That the research would say that's enormous for you and for them. The way Cloud and Townsend talk about this is they use the word intruders and invaders, that there's only room for 2 people in a marriage, and as soon as you make room for a third, that's when you're in trouble. In fact, this is a little bit off those notes, but one of the other things that I bumped into is that they say one of the greatest pieces of evidence that there's not 3 people in the marriage, that there's a dynamic where it's us 2 and nobody else, happens when one spouse is asked by a friend or a mother-in-law or whoever, hey, do you want to go fishing on Saturday? You know what they say is one of the best ways to know whether or not there's only 2 people in the marriage? To listen to the spouse's response. And if the response is, yeah, I can do that, that's a bad sign. And if the response is, I don't know, let me talk to my wife. Not because she's controlling and she wears the pants, not because he's controlling, but because we're so one that we don't make our decisions alone. We just don't do that. Second thing, I got to speed it up here, is what they talk about is recreating without the kids. Again, you had a life before you had kids, right? So my friend Fred, who you all know now, I remember when I was a high school pastor, there was always all this commotion with families about like family night and mandatory family night, and I was always getting sideways with parents because somehow I was threatening their family night because their kid was supposed to be with them and he wanted to be with me, and I just never knew what to do with that. I wasn't raised in a Christian household, so that was all very confusing to me. And I would say to Fred, what did you do mandatory family night? And he said, Adam, our general bent, though we kind of wavered it from time to time, we would make exceptions, our general bent was we wanted to communicate to our kids, we knew how to have fun before you got here, and we'll know how to have fun after you're gone. And when you want to be a part of that with us, then that's great. And so they worked hard to have recreational things they did together, and they included their kids as much as they could and as much as their kids wanted to be, but they made sure that there was a recreational pattern that was just between them. Another way to say this is their only form of recreation was not their kids' soccer games. In fact, you want to hear something risky, one of the things Fred did, I've never heard anyone else that ever shared this advice, so you can take it for what it's worth. He would strategically skip he raised daughters, some of their volleyball games. Not a lot, but once a year or so, he would miss a game, if only to communicate to them, life's not about you, And life's not about soccer. It's about way more than you and sports. He was supportive, but he just wanted to make sure that there wasn't this overemphasis on that. Third thing, and these last two won't surprise you, we'll just put them both up and kind of talk to them all at once, is the date nights. Date nights and weekends away. There's no getting away from this in the research. It is best practice. We all know this. Here's my confession. I don't do them often enough either. And when we do have a date night, all the credits to my wife. Here's my challenge. If it's not on the calendar, it doesn't happen, right? So here's what I'm doing tomorrow. My wife doesn't even know this, but I'm going to sit down. We're going to sit down, because Monday's my day off, and we're going to schedule our date nights now through August. Because you know how it happens, right? Like you have the best of intentions, then life happens, and they never work themselves out. And if you ran your business that way, you'd be bankrupt. And if you ran your friendships that way, you wouldn't have any. And if you ran your hobbies that way, you would never have any of those either. Like we schedule stuff that matters to us. So here's my challenge to you, especially you men. Sit down with a calendar. I don't care whether it's once a week or once a month. Schedule them. Every quarter, just schedule your date nights. And then there's the weekends away thing, enormous in the research. But I want to end here, because the good news is that Jesus tells us how to play our own wiring in whatever direction we want to end up. Listen to how he ends this passage on treasuring. He says, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." See, here's the deal. That's not an observation so much as it's a promise. What Jesus is telling you is wherever you spend your time, wherever you spend your energy, wherever you spend your resource, your heart will go that direction. In church world, what we know is people stop giving before they stop attending. This is kind of deep in the bowels of church world, so sorry. But I want you to think about that. Why? It's real simple, right? Because when we stop spending our treasure on something, we stop caring about it as much. And eventually, we don't really care about the Easter egg hunt as much because we're not really vested in it. But when we're vested in it, we're passionate about it. Listen, here's my point. Whatever that goal is, whatever your passion is, whatever that win is, however it is you're defining success, and especially if you're married and you want to stay married beyond your kids graduating, the key is this. You've got to pre-decide to leverage large parts of your being for that marriage. And what Jesus says is the person who goes on date nights will continue to stay married, and it's a chicken and the egg thing. But it's because they've pre-decided. This is what I'm going to be passionate about. And because they've leveraged time in that direction, their heart stays in that direction. So I don't know how you're wrestling with goals and ambition and accomplishment, but I think Jesus has a lot to say for you.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.